We have a really interesting session today on social movements and the politics of debt, transnational resistance against debt on three continents, with Christoph Sorg, who's going to be talking about his recent book. He is a researcher based at Ruhr University Bochum. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. And his research focuses on intersectional theories of capitalism, social movements, globalization, digitalization, finance, and debt. And he has also published, besides his recent book that he'll be talking to us about, he has also recently published on the possibilities of democratic economic planning in the age of digitalization and critical sociology. And so Christoph is going to talk to us for about 15 minutes. And then we have two great discussants as well, David Bailey and Bernd Bonfert, which I'm sure you know, but I'm going to introduce them briefly as well. And Bernd Bonfert is a postdoctoral researcher in the Department of Environmental Science at Aarhus University, and he's also a member of the CPERN board and of the editorial board of the Global Political Economy journal, and he has published recently in the Journal of Rural Studies, Globalizations and Capital and Class. And David Bailey is an associate professor in politics at the University of Birmingham, and he is the convener of CPERN. He has a forthcoming co-authored article in Environmental Politics on the critical political economy of climate activism. So we'll get started with Christoph for 15 minutes, and then after the commentaries from David and Bernd, we will open up for discussion for everyone. Thank you.
Okay, should I start? Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me to this, and thank you everyone for attending. I'll take my own time. The book is, beforehand we agreed that I'll basically cover a bunch of themes of the book. It's probably 10 to 15 minutes isn't enough to really go into depth, but I'll kind of elaborate on a couple of things that I think are more important. On the context of the book is that this was my PhD research that I worked on for a bit after my PhD also, and then turned into a book. And now, in the meantime, I had transitioned towards studying alternatives to capitalism, like alternative economic formations, theories, alternative economic models, with a particular focus on economic planning. But I've recently kind of revisited my work on debt resistance because I was kind of curious what had happened in the field in the meantime, because I think the COVID crisis, and now with the the return to increasing federal interest rates and a looming southern debt crisis, I think this is a topic that we'll have to talk about again quite frequently in the future. I think those two are actually related, because I think a lot of the themes in those struggles around debt and finance, they really relate quite nicely to questions over investment and the question of how to democratize investment, which is the kind of fundamental question that people in the literature on democratic planning kind of pose. How could we democratize that towards sustainable and social goals? And this really relates to the debt struggles. Yeah, but back to the book. This is basically based on ethnographic fieldwork that I did between 2014 and 2016, which kind of brought together participant observation, interviews, and document analysis. And it's kind of, the field was a field of transnational networks for debt abolition that kind of spanned across Europe and North Africa, and to a certain extent to the US. This is a kind of network structure that had emerged after the North Atlantic financial crisis. And this is what I kind of went to the field, did participant action research during the anti-austerity movements after the financial crisis. And I got curious in that I felt that is a really pivotal issue here. It's something that the movements talk about a lot, and there's a bunch of actors who explicitly organize around that. So this is kind of something that I got interested in studying, and I basically followed those networks around, tried to study what they do, how they how they read the world, and how they rationalize their actions, and what the broader context of capitalism is. With that kind of framing, is one of the this kind of bringing together of kind of analyzing capitalism and analyzing social movements is something that I was also heavily influenced by. There was a debate at the time in social movement studies of bringing capitalism back in, kind of the category of capitalism and the large-scale transformations related to capitalism, really formative for social movement studies as a discipline to emerge. And the early scholars, while they kind of tried to differentiate themselves from Marxism, and they argued that there's a bunch of Marxist notions. So this is in the 60s and 70s. They argued there's some Marxist assumptions that they reject, but they were heavily influenced still by kind of theories of capitalism, also Marxist theories of capitalism. But this got kind of lost along the way, and it was a kind of call to think about, to seriously think about capitalism and what it means for social movements today. But I was also always happy to join kind of CPERN meetings and network meetings, and I was really inspired by people within CPERN who argued that in critical political economy, there should be a stronger focus on social movements also, to kind of focus on contestation and struggle, and not only on kind of elite projects for domination. And I think those kind of two they really got nicely, they went together really well. So this is kind of how I try to, this is the kind of debates I wanted to interact with. Yeah. And this is basically the theoretical gap I found in the literature that relates to that. So I felt that there wasn't that much theoretical literature on as a resistance against that. There's some really interesting literature, and it's a growing body on debt in general, and on debt and domination, and what it means for inequality and what it means for social control. But how does resistance against debt work? This is something that I didn't find as much. There's an interesting body on resistance after the Southern debt crisis and the kind of transnational networks that emerged. I found that literature very interesting. I found it lacking a little bit. So some of it was a kind of social movement studies perspectives that really didn't talk about capitalism, and I kind of felt that debt was kind of a generic category. It could be anything else that they were struggling about. It was really like, so what do they do? What do they say? Kind of social movement analysis, but not really embedded. And so what is it about? Was there something particular about that they're struggling about? So this was what I kind of tried to theoretically contribute to. So what is particular about that here? And I can only go over kind of a summary of kind of some of the things I found very important, and then maybe with some of them we can go into detail later in the debate. First of all, I talk about contentious debt politics as a mixture of contentious politics and debt politics. Contentious politics is collective political struggle. Debt politics is about debt, but it's also about the rules that govern debt. This is what I kind of tried to study. This is how I tried to frame it. And there, one thing I found is that, not too surprising, so this really needs to be embedded in studies of capitalism across time and space. Across space, because there's different varieties of capitalism. And so those different varieties are integrated in a particular way into the world market and the interstate system. And that really matters for struggles against sovereign and against household debt in particular locations. But capitalism also varies across time, and there, particularly for what I was studying, the financialization of capitalism was particularly important. And there's a really interesting body of literature. It's actually several bodies of literature that study financialization. they were really fruitful there. I found debt crises to be pivotal. So the actors I studied, they were continuously working, and debt politics is a continuous issue. But when we really kind of collectively, when it comes into the limelight, and when debt really gets spoken about, is during debt crises, and that's when the particular way debt is governed becomes really important, and that's when kind of accumulation of inequality and contradictions really explodes, and that's why the series of southern debt crises were really important for the formation of transnational networks for debt abolition, and that's why the North Atlantic financial crisis of 2007 and 8 was really important to kind of spill that over to the global north and to kind of further transnationalize those networks. Because it really it kind of, those crises, they disrupt everyday routines, they really exacerbate grievances, they break up kind of patterns, they make things imaginable, and they create new threats and new opportunities, and that's when kind of things really accelerate. So this is really important. And related to that, public debt is really important. So private corporate debt, household debt, public debt, they're all kind of related. In a financialization of capitalism, they can really translate into each other, and public debt normally is the pivot that kind of translate one kind of debt into another one, and that's one that it's more likely that a struggle is happening around. The 2007-8 debt crisis, it was a private corporate crisis, but it got translated into a public crisis because the debts were translated into public debt. So this is, and also in the southern debt crisis, whenever there was struggle around how to deal with the debt crisis, what frequently happened is that public debt was used also there as a kind of mechanism to kind of channel public resources to recapitalize banks that had misspeculated. And so public debt is really an important one. Yeah. And public debt has those kind of consequences of having to unleash austerity and all those downward spirals that happen from there on. Yeah. Maybe just to close, the once kind of debt crises exacerbate the situation, and actors kind of find it worthwhile to organize around debt, and kind of debt becomes a more contested issue. I found there was the social movement studies categories I found to work quite nicely. So I think the social movement studies literature is to a certain degree helpful there. So maybe something we can talk about more later. The way I conceptualized it was to argue that basically if mobilization happens, there need to be debtors unions or debtors clubs. Debtors unions would be kind of networks of indebted individual people, and debtors clubs would be kind of networks of highly indebted poor countries. Because this is basically the relationship between a debtor and a creditor it's a social relationship. It's one mediated by power relations, and it's a clash of interest. So in debt crises, they really pose the question of whose assets get destroyed and who pays for the crisis. And there, basically, it's not a consensual. There's not a consensual situation possible where both kind of win. It's not a win-win situation. Can't happen. So it's basically the task for debtors would be to organize collectively, and debtors being structurally isolated in a systemic way. This is basically there's a way where the collective debt can be turned into a weapon by threatening for collective default. The Cartagena group, Latin America, during Southern debt crisis is kind of an example. There was discussions in the debt networks if there could be, in the Greek debt crisis, if such a network could be created in Southern Europe. It's never something that got large, but the kind of mechanism this would look like, threatening mass default. And basically the debtors have an incentive to really collectively organize, and then to split the creditors. Likewise, the creditors have an incentive to split the debtors and to kind of always just negotiate with one debtors and to not let them have strength in numbers. So this kind of necessity for collective organization and to create strength in numbers is a constant that I found. And then something that I haven't really decided on how to call it, I sometimes call it deconstructing debt fetishism, or maybe the hegemonic morality of debt, is something that the kind of common sense notion debts have to be paid, and the morality around that is there's a very interesting body of literature in economic sociology around that. Is something that debtors are continuously kind of faced with. So there's the intuition, the common sense notion would be that somebody who's indebted, like an individual or a state, has done something wrong, is a moral failure. So if you're faced with that, there's a need to deconstruct that and to create frames that kind of reverse that gaze. So it's not looking on the debtor and looking on how much avocado toast they're eating, but it's really kind of turning this around and arguing that maybe there was predatory creditor behavior, maybe there was illegal creditor behavior, or maybe there's systemic rules that are set against the debtor. But those frames need to kind of turn the camera around, not kind of hyper visibilize the debtor, but instead look at the creditor or the systemic rules. And there's a varieties of ways this can be done. And this needs to be turned around. And then when those come together, so when there's a way of when those frames are created and when there's collective organization, then there's still the question of strategy and of repertoires of action. And there, as a kind of, I think I'm approaching 50 minutes, I'm closing with this. There's something I called this fight, the options to fight the creditors, to circumvent them or to compromise with them or to kind of create a compromise. And then I realized Eric Olin Wright had written 1.5 books about that kind of stuff in a much more detailed way, something that I still need to find out. But I guess it's nice that I found in the field what he was writing about. So this is kind of definitely validating his work. There's those three strategies basically mean you threaten default, that's fighting the creditors, saying we're not going to pay in various kind of ways. There's a way of kind of trying to reach a compromise and arguing maybe the strength of the better argument, like that's not that likely, but like reaching a compromise. Maybe we're going to restructure some debt and there's some conditionality. Or just circumventing the creditors in a more kind of long-term struggle to like the Bank of the South project, or kind of creating financial bottom-up financial institutions that circumvent the creditors. That's the kind of three strategies that exist, and they can complement each other in a way that like a more transgressive militant strategy can threaten can kind of create a scenario where the creditors are more likely to accept a compromise, for instance. So those are the things that I think would make up, if we were to theorize struggles over debt. I think those things need to be kind of put together. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. Very good timing. So we'll continue with Bernd as the first discussant, and I'm going to ask for 5-6 minutes from Bernd. Thank you.
All right. Yeah, then first of all, congratulations on the book. I was not able to finish reading it, but I was very excited about what I've read from it. Because I'm really impressed by the depth of your argument, by the sharpness of your theorization. Because as you know, Christoph, I also did my own PhD on the wider anti-austerity movement in a way where I just didn't theorize debt in the way that you did. And so in that sense, I'm really impressed by how well and how insightful you're able to do that. And also very much impressed by the fact that you're able to track the development of these anti-debt movements over time in a way that actually tracks how different coalitions emerge and grow dormant and split up, which in my own research I found relatively difficult to do, because activists don't necessarily announce when their work grows dormant. So it's really, really deep and important work. I'm particularly excited about the things you just talked about at the end, this distinction between different anti-debt strategies, where you're talking about Eurodat, about CRDTM and ICANN, because this triple distinction between a more advocacy-oriented approach, a more confrontational mobilization approach, and perhaps a more horizontal prefigurative approach, that almost perfectly mirrors my own research on the anti-austerity movement, which is not coincidental, because as you said, it's very much reflected in Eric Olin Wright's writing about the various trajectories of transformative strategies that struggles can have. But I think it's still really interesting to see how both of our work kind of finds that in praxis as well. And I feel like that's maybe something where we should get together and maybe write something about it, because it's really, really exciting. I also really like, as someone who focused on the wider anti-austerity movement, I really like in the book how you explain the intersection between anti-debt activism and this wider movement against, or these wider movements against austerity. Because you describe it really well, that even though all of these movements ultimately mobilized against austerity, they didn't necessarily even define themselves around debt, or even frame debt as a major issue, because they tended to encompass things like housing activism. There were labor struggles around the care sector. There was even the wider solidarity economy and so on. They were all very much related to it, but did not necessarily focus on it. Which at the same time created opportunities for collaboration, which you also describe, and which I myself also found in practice when I did my own field work with, for instance, transnational coalitions of housing activists or finance activists, where there was always at least one member representative of CRDTM or of the Jubilee Debt Campaign from the UK actually in the room and in the part of the coalition, and actually trying to share their own expertise on that, and educate the other activists on how debt is ultimately related to the struggles they were all mobilizing around. But at the same time, I'm not sure how much that actually affected the other activists, or to what extent that actually had an impact on their conception of their own struggle in the long term. So that would be also kind of my question to you, what your perception of that is. Like how mutual is that exchange between those activists and those movements, or is it a bit more unidirectional, let's say? And then also a second point where I'm kind of wondering is this distinction between different forms of debt, because you very much focus on sovereign debt, but you also explain that there is a distinction to be made between sovereign debt, between individual household debt, between corporate debt. And you explain that they are inherently related, and ultimately contentious debt politics means having to organize debtors, be they individual households or countries, deconstructing this debt fetishism and confronting creditors ultimately. So in a sense, you kind of argue that it doesn't really matter whether it's individual households or entire states, they just need to organize as debt cartels in a way, which I can understand that argument, but at the same time, I feel like it's almost a bit realist, like in IR terms, if you know what I mean. Because obviously states are not uniform actors. There are condensations of power relations. There are different social forces within any given state, many of which, especially the most powerful of which, are actually in favor of that debt relation. So even when you're talking about what we could call, I don't know, debtor states or relatively impoverished countries that are very much dependent on creditors, even there we will often see right-wing or conservative governments very happily implementing austerity against their own population, having not really any trouble with redistributing wealth in favor of their wealthy supporters away from the working class, away from the public sector, and so on. So in that sense, this question of with sovereign debt, who is actually affected by it, how they're affected by it, and whose agency contests it, whether the government actually contests that debt, or whether it's necessary for movements to mobilize against their own government, is, I think, a very crucial question. So that, I think, merits a distinction there, because I also think it makes a difference in terms of what movements we're looking at, and who is mobilized by those movements, because obviously sovereign debt affects people indirectly via austerity. So there you would have movements mobilizing around or against privatizations, around the erosion of the welfare system, and so on. Whereas with private individualized debt, that affects people, for instance, via mortgages, via tuition fees, and so on. And there are mobilizations there too, but they tend to be different ones. There you have certain types of housing activists, you have student activists, like in the US currently. And then even corporate debt can, I suppose, affect cooperatives, it can affect the solidarity economy. So in that sense, that can also be a cause for progressive struggles by entirely different types of actors. So yeah, that, of course, I'm generalizing a bit here too, but I'm just really interested in this question of this debt relation, who it actually affects and what implications that has for progressive strategies and for what social forces are actually being mobilized and can actually be turned into alliances against that. And based on that, also kind of the question, why don't movements focus, or why don't these types of movements frame their struggles more explicitly around debt? And yeah, the question of whether the fact that it is perhaps not as unifying as anti-debt activists would like it to be. Yeah, would very much like to hear your position on that. And yeah, with that, I'm finished.
Thank you, Bernd. So we'll take David's comments as well, and Christoph, if that's okay, and then we'll hear back. So David, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Christoph, and thanks, Bernd, for the comments before me. Yeah, thanks, Christoph, for the book. I mean, just generally, I think it's really good, and congratulations on publishing it and getting it out. And I mean, just in terms of the debate, the early debates that you were mentioning, I mean, for me, it's really good to see the book project, and it really speaks to some of the arguments that Monica and I were trying to make perhaps about 5 or 6 years ago around like how critical political economy is to think more about resistance and social movements. So it was really nice to see the way that you took that argument and then developed it into the discussion of contesting debt. So it was I really like that, and I like the way that you pitched it in terms of two sets of debates. One in terms of social movements, that is trying to think about how to bring capitalism back in, and then in critical political economy, trying to think about shifting the emphasis a bit away from domination to forms of resistance. So, I mean, I think you did a really good job of doing that in the book, and so well done. And just in terms of, I mean, I suppose in terms of going back to those debates, I did kind of think about to what degree of social movement studies kept going with that argument. And I think maybe it's a bit of bias, but I think critical political economy has done a better job of incorporating the need for resistance than perhaps social movement studies. I think if you get a copy of Social Movement Studies journal or a current issue, I think it hasn't changed much in terms of a lot of it's basically looking at what social movements do rather than contextualizing it within capitalism, which was their call. And I think perhaps critical political economy has done a better job of trying to think about how do we bring resistance into that study. But I think it's still difficult. I think part of the reason the debate continues is because it remains difficult to think about how do you actually think about domination and resistance at the same time. I think basically there's a tendency to do one or the other, and what we really want to be doing is thinking about social struggle as the mediation of the capitalist context in which it occurs, and the capacity for agency and resistance within that context. And so struggle is really the focus, I think, but struggle not as just resistance, but struggle as mediation of the capitalist context within which it occurs. And I thought you did a really excellent job of basically summarizing that attempt in this sort of theory part. I'm just going to copy the whole section here where you kind of summarize that as it's applied to the question of debt, which I thought was a really helpful way of thinking about how should we actually study debt, but also how should we study social trends and processes more generally within capitalism from a critical approach. So I was really pleased that you kind of helped us to think about that as what it is that we're trying to do. In terms of the more concrete part of the the book. In other words, what is debt and how do we resist it, and what are the social movements that try to resist debt? I suppose some of my questions were around. I suppose one of my most general question, I suppose, is around how successful was and has debt been contested? Because I think I accept the argument that debt has been contested to the extent that people are willing, and there's a general kind of sentiment within the public debate to accept that the debt that was produced prior to 2008 wasn't a legitimate form of debt, and that the banks and banking systems benefited unfairly from a mountain of debt that they produced and then burst and then tried to offload the consequences onto individuals. I think that argument in terms of the sphere of legitimacy was definitely successful. I guess my question is, to what extent was actually the consequences of debt shifted away from the individuals who had been unfairly shouldered with that burden, the degree to which there was a resistance was able to actually shift the burden of repaying the debt to others successful. So the kind of more material forms of the material consequences and the material form of debt, to what degree was that successfully contested? I guess I'm less sure whether that happened or not, and I'd be interested to see what you think about whether debt could be resisted. I was also interested in kind of resistance as resistance happens when protest. Resistance happens also when protest doesn't happen, if you see what I mean, because it's the fear amongst those in power of the potential for resistance can also produce consequences, so that you won't actually see the actual visible resistance in itself. And I mean, for me, I think that with the fact that we've had 15 years of virtually zero interest rates is in part a result of the fact that those controlling the interest rates were fearful of the consequences if they just simply let people have this huge amounts of debt on their shoulders, just simply have to deal with it. And just basically you borrowed the money, therefore it's your fault, therefore you pay it back kind of logic. If that had been applied, then there wouldn't have been, I think, such a focus on quantitative easing for 15 years. So maybe that's also a kind of a consequence perhaps of the potential for resistance. And also, obviously, like you mentioned at the beginning, it's also interesting to think, well, we actually seem to be getting towards the end of that period now. There's a gradual shifting of interest rates above zero, which is kind of, I guess, the main debate in monetary policy, but also more generally in terms of managing capitalism currently. And so it's interesting to think about what's going to happen now. And are we going to see new forms of debt resistance and social movements around debt emerge into the present? And it's difficult to say much more concretely in 5 minutes, but I'll just try and say one more thing, which you sort of alluded to as well, but the whole kind of like COVID and then post-COVID management of debt. I mean, obviously the mountain of debt increased even further, or liquidity that exists in circulation in the global economy increased even further as a result of COVID. And that seems to have created a headache further still for public policy makers and politicians, which produces, again, sort of interesting outcomes. And essentially what we're seeing now, I suppose, is a contestation through the cost of living crisis and the contestation of the cost of living crisis. What we're seeing is policymakers and politicians trying to think about how they deal with an attempt to reduce the debt that they accrued during the COVID period, and again, how they offload that away from themselves and onto the shoulders of individuals and ordinary people and us, basically, and how that then gets contested. So I was just thinking about how the collapse of the Truss government was. I think the collapse of the Truss government was basically a result, in large part, of this the way that the consequences of their policies produced this sharp increase in mortgage rates, which then obviously was a form of debt, and how debt's experienced at the level of the household, and how that again shows how it's difficult to handle it. So I suppose what I'm saying is the question of debt is interesting, and the question of resistance is interesting, but resistance both in terms of how it's visible and also how it's invisible. And I think you do an excellent job of showing how the visible forms of protest produced different outcomes and were direct expressions of anti-neoliberalism in that period, and then thinking about how that's going to happen into the future. And Monica wants me to stop, so I'll stop.
Thank you. Thanks. So I think if we all agree, we'll open the floor for further contributions, and then we can have a kind of final response from Christoph at the end, so we can hear everyone else. But thank you for Christoph's presentation, and also for Bernd and David's discussion comments. So the floor is open. Feel free to jump in or raise your hand. Well, I'll ask a question then. I'll break the ice. So more than it's actually a question, not so much a point of discussion, but it was prompted by something that Bernd mentioned, and it kind of made me wonder, from my own experience as well, of having done some research on some kind of debt movements, particularly kind of housing and movements, but knowing as well some of the kind of public debt movements, I wonder to what extent the type of activists that focus more on kind of debt audits or kind of generally public debt activism tend to be kind of more experts in a sense, whether it's a type of activism that requires a certain level of expertise, whilst, for example, that activists in housing movements, the reason for activism has to do more out of need, basically. You know, I can no longer pay my mortgage, and therefore I'm gonna go and do something about it. But for some of those other ones, maybe, you know, and I'm thinking from the ones I know myself, you know, maybe more economists, more people that perhaps are just a curiosity, and well, you can tell us. But we have hands. So Jeffrey, go ahead, and then Hector. Jeffrey, the floor is yours whenever you're ready. We'll go with Hector then, and then we'll try again.
Hi, everybody. Congratulations to Christoph for the book. I started to read it last week, so I found it like really fascinating. My question is about the connection between the national movements against austerity and the transnational movements. On my own research, I follow the free education campaigns, and now I'm quite interested in the politics of debt cancellation in the case of students in the US, and I don't see necessarily an immediate connection between these transnational networks and the national ones. So I was wondering if your research, you find those connections, or if you find some tensions or parallelism that help to understand why they not necessarily connect with each other. Thanks.
Thank you, Hector. Jeffrey, if you're
yes,
ready.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, okay. First of all, I'd like to, yes, thank you. I thought the book was a very good update, really, for me anyway, up till 2016 on the sovereign debt issue. First of all, I'd like to agree very much with Bernd. I didn't see it in the book that there was such a conflation of household debt, personal debt, and sovereign debt. But if there was, then there should not be, because this is almost the atomization of the state. There is no comparison between household debt and sovereign debt, except in the name that it's debt. So that brings me to my basic question. I thought I was reading about transnational or international movements or possibilities of opposing sovereign debt. And I could not find in the book any mention of international trade unions. So, for example, on page 82, you say trade unions played a pivotal role in early brokerage and regional organizations and could easily mobilize their members to protest events. Now, I assume that you're talking about domestic trade unions. And I wondered if in your ethnographic research, you did stumble across the efforts of international trade unions to do something about it. I have to declare a personal interest in this because 30 years ago this year, I wrote a book about labor and third world debt, which was translated into Urdu, distributed free at the World Forum in Danish, was widely distributed in Latin America, and I trundled around the world trying to get elites in different countries from Pakistan to the Philippines not to allow the IMF in to organize their economies. And that seems to be entirely missing. Now, there is one reason why it might be missing, because me and my colleagues in the international trade union world were highly suspicious of intellectual researchers. And often, in fact, I know one of the international secretaries at that time that absolutely said we will never, ever give an interview. So it's possible that there is a lacuna there. On the other hand, it was around, and I wondered if you did ever hear about the international trade union movement efforts between 1974 and 1995, basically. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Comments? Clemens, I think the hand has come down. I don't know if that means.
Yeah, no, I still have a question. I don't know if you can hear me. I'm on my way to a trade union meeting, so this is a bit hectic.
Perfect.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Great. Thank you. So I'll go ahead. I have two questions. Feel free to disregard them if they are too big. The first is when states spend a lot of money like they did in the COVID crisis, it's been characterized as emergency Keynesianism, and I strongly disagree with this characterization, but I don't really know why. And I was wondering if there is anything in the nature of the debt that this provoked, that this creates, which could back that argument. And the second question, and actually there is a shout out to CPERN here because this is work I'm doing with Jaime and we've met through CPERN. We're working on time and capitalism. And I was wondering if there is something about debt which makes it hard to resist to because of the temporal dimension it has. The fact that it sort of commodifies, financializes your life and groups of people's lives for years ahead. I'm very sorry for the conditions in which I'm making these questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. We probably have space for one more before we give Christoph a chance to respond, and maybe David and Bernd if they wanna. So no? Okay, then Christoph, if we can maybe kind of tackle some of those, and then Bernd and David will also give you a chance to have some concluding remarks.
I've noted like 20 to 25 questions. Maybe do you want to give me a time limit so I can see how far I get?
Basically, we have to finish in the next 13 minutes. So okay. I would say try and answer in about 5-6 minutes in case that prompts somebody else's response.
Cool. Okay. I'll pick the ones that I know answers to, and I'll have you all assume I would have known ansers to the one I actually didn't know any answers to.
That's the best strategy ever.
Perfect.
Welcome to academia.
Yeah. Okay. So wait, I have a list of things here. So about the relationship to anti-austerity movements, yeah, I think I'm happy. So this is to Bernd. I'm happy that you see a lot of similarities. So maybe I'll answer several questions at the same time. So because Monica, you asked if there are to a certain extent experts, and I think yes. So my observation was that the ones who particularly work on that, and they've worked on that for a long time. There was a lot of efforts to do popular education, especially by the Acampada movements. There was more spirit of finance is deliberately kind of a vague language that excludes people, and we need to understand what's going on. There's a lot of effort there, but at the same time, to a certain extent, it was a series of kind of popular experts, of activist experts. And that relates to the relationship to the anti-austerity movements, because those were people who found that is really important. That's something that we should organize around. They were kind of struggling. They had frames against financialization. And then in an example like the Greek debt crisis, you could see how this would work out. So you have a broader anti-austerity movement, but then you have a concrete question of, okay, should we cut the debt? And what happens if we do? Should we leave the Eurozone and so on? There's a bunch of technical questions in this Syriza government. And they have this Truth Commission on debt. And the Truth Commission, the head of the scientific head of that is basically one of the most well-known activists in the debt field. And the kind of committee is filled with long-standing experienced activists and campaigners around that, who know how international law works, what are the precedents, how would you legally kind of go through with that, and so on and so forth. And they kind of basically become the experts that work together with Syriza. I guess that also relates, and if we talk about Syriza, I guess this is one of the examples. So I kind of framed this very unfortunately, and I think if I understood Jeffrey correctly, he said that it doesn't seem like that in the book, and I agree that I take the state as this kind of this monolithic actor. The struggles against sovereign debt that I've looked at, it would always be kind of coalitions of social movements and movement parties, and a kind of broad kind of campaign and push to cancel debt, which is the only kind of way this could be attempted. And then there would need to be continuous social movement struggle to kind of keep the government off course, because there's going to be a lot of backlash and a lot of pressure to not cut the debt or to kind of take this back, and so on and so forth. In case of Argentina and Ecuador and so on. So yeah, this is probably the better way to think about this. What I was kind of trying to say is that once you have maybe have a network of states who are willing to cancel the debt or have debt crises and they get together, then you have this kind of dynamic that if you threaten to cancel the debt collectively, you kind of create, this is saying, if you, this is always gets quoted in this kind of text, right? Like you owe the debt the bank €100, the bank owns you, you owe $1 billion, you own the bank. This kind of logic of creating this collective threat. This is when the US intervenes in the Latin American debt crisis in the 80s, when they think this is a threat to our banks. And that's when it gets interesting. And that's why this kind of creating a strength in numbers is important, even though those states need to be deconstructed and there might be reactionary forces in the states, or it might just, the coalition might fall apart and so on and so forth. Okay. How to relate critical political economy and social movement studies. I think I agree with David that critical political economy has done a better job. That's why I've moved from one field to the other. I think one of the ways to think about this is that social movement studies has always criticized that what they argued, what Marxists said in the 60s, which I'm a bit skeptical about, is a bit of a construction, that you have all these inequalities and therefore you have struggle, and they argued, oh, well, but a lot of injustices aren't acted upon, yada yada yada, this kind of narrative. And I think there's something to it, clearly, but there's one way to think about this in social movement studies, is to study capitalism and the transformations, and then that impacts the political opportunities, the threats, the mobilizing structures and the repertoires, and so on and so forth. This is, so capitalism changes and then this impacts the way struggle happens. And I think this is a worthwhile way to think about it. Another really important one would be to look the other way around. How do social movements shape capitalism and contest capitalism? And then capitalism has to respond. the way this all starts, the financialization crisis is related to a crisis of profitability in the 60s and 70s, and that comes from feminist movements, anti-colonial movements, worker movements, and so on and so forth. And they want a bigger share of the pie, and they they're unhappy with the Keynesian compromise, and the neoliberalism is a response to that. I think that's a part of the picture that often gets left out. And another way to do it would be to look at the contentious politics approach and to break it down, to break capitalism down, to look at more at kind of meso-level interactions and a continuous feedback of mobilization from below and challenges and responses from top, and a continuous kind of interaction of those two. That's just very broadly how I think we could think about that and how we could bring them together. I think several questions have kind of related to how successful has this been, and I think not very much, unfortunately. Sorry to sound defeatist. I think so. The good and bad news is that the underlying crisis of secular stagnation and lack of profitability of capitalism and the related financialization is still there. So this is still an open playing field, and I think probably we're going to have to talk about this again when the current crisis escalates. I think what this has been successful in is gaining a lot of experiences. The people who have been kind of politicized and mobilized and socialized by those campaigns, they're still around. I feel like part of what I was personally missing in the movement responses to 2007 and 8 was a lack of kind of clarity of, okay, maybe we need to socialize finance, and here's a kind of ways, a bunch of ways we could do this. Maybe this is me projecting because I felt unprepared, but I think there's definitely buildup of knowledge, but ultimately this wasn't successful. Maybe this relates to, I think it was, I don't remember, was it Hector, who said that they were studying the US debt crisis. I think they're in the question of how this relates to transnationalism. I think the US case is one of the ones that was at least a tiny bit of progress, but still I haven't followed this exactly, but I feel the process has been stalled. But there's a clear line of from Occupy, the people I interviewed who went from Occupy to the Debt Collective, which burned a lot. This was in my main focus, was something I stumbled across, was it's a clear line of people who kind of grew as people and who figured out that this is what they want to work on, and who built networks, and who went to kind of who joined Black Lives Matter protests and built a kind of anti-racist coalition against that, but also on class terms and so on, and building a debtors movement. And I think this is the most progressed debtors union in the global north at the moment. And the way I understand it, I'm not an expert, I think they were important with their struggles against student debt and those the Corinthian college and so on. And I think this has been important in putting this on the agenda of the Bernie Sanders campaign, and now on the Biden campaign, but I'm not sure. The transnational links there were weak in the US case. Like they were aware of the European and the global networks, and they talked to people, but it wasn't formative, I think, in that case. Like they were doing their own thing. But that's only my superficial reading. It's just based on 1 or 2 interviews. Yeah. Do I have time? I don't know if maybe I'm.
No, I think I'll have to cut you off so that David and Bernd can have a final.
Sorry about that.
If you don't mind. Thank you.
No, I don't.
Thanks.
Thank you very much.
So Bernd, if you can give a final comment in a minute and a half.
Okay, not really a conclusion as such, but I had a thought on Clemence's question about the role of time in this relation, where I was just reminded of the fact that the German government tended to argue for austerity on the basis that public debt was considered something that was very damaging for future generations. Specifically, that was very much their framing. So this temporal dimension was very much emphasized. They basically took this very material power relation and kind of masked it as a generational moral obligation. So I guess in that sense, it's a way to uphold this debt fetishism the way Christoph describes it. And there I kind of find it interesting that completely different note that current climate movements kind of use the same argument, but in a progressive way, this focus on future generations, and in a way that ideally does not ignore the material power dimensions underlying it. But yeah, finish with that.
Thank you. David, do you want to give us the final wisdom?
Thanks. Yeah, no, thanks for the discussion, and it's really good to hear more about Christoph's book and how it's developing as well in the current context. Just on Clemence's question about emergency Keynesianism, which I think there is a link actually to the struggle over debt and the question of Keynesianism, in that I think I would say I wouldn't be quite so bothered about using the term emergency Keynesianism. I mean, I think maybe if we just think about Keynesianism as how does the state play a role in trying to manage the contradictions that capitalism is facing to enable it to be sustained, sort of, by in an attempt to mitigate and respond to the various crises that inevitably are thrown up. That then, rather than say it's like it's definitely Keynesian at one point and it's definitely neoliberal at another, then I think it's less of a problem to say it was an emergency Keynesianism to respond to COVID, in that the state stepped in to try to solve the crisis as a temporary measure. So I wouldn't necessarily see that as much of a problem. And then I think you can relate that to the question of struggle over debt, because like Christoph was saying, debt is kind of contradictory as well, because you want to resist it, but the creditor also has an interest in avoiding a total incapacity to repay the debt. So the creditor also is trying to deal with the contradiction of keeping the debtor on the hook, but also preventing the debtor from total bankruptcy. So there's a kind of managing the contradictions of the debtor-creditor relationship as well that I think has parallels with that idea of how does the state work within capitalism. So the state is a product of struggle, and also the debtor-creditor relationship is a product of struggle, which is kind of what I got from Christoph's book as well. So that's a kind of indirect response to Clemence's question, but I think it also relates to the general key kind of the general point about capitalism that Christoph's making with regard to debtor-creditor relations.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, thank you. We've managed to finish quite punctual, and I think it was a really great session. I recommend that those of you that haven't read Christoph's work, and considering the book is open access, so please download it and read it over the Christmas holidays. That's kind of a really good plan, I think. And thank you so much for attending. We have quite an interesting program lined up for 2023, so please check. It's always the last Thursday of the month, I think, except obviously this one was a bit earlier because of the Christmas break. So I hope you have a really good break and you come back. As David has just shared the link, so make sure that you sign up to the mailing list, which is where we advertise everything, and make sure that you follow CPERN on Twitter as well, where you can also see all of those things. And thank you so much. I hope you all have a great start to 2023.
Thank you very much for organizing this.
Thank you.